I used to believe I understood power. Not the loud kind that announces itself with arrogance, but the restrained force that shifts outcomes without ever raising its voice. I built my empire inside glass towers where conversations softened when I entered and decisions carried consequences far beyond the room. Before we begin, take a moment to consider something uncomfortable. How many times has power disguised itself as generosity? How often has success convinced someone they understood another person's struggle without ever asking? This story isn't just about wealth, race, or status. It's about the silent damage that can grow inside unchecked certainty. If you believe dignity doesn't depend on money, if you believe true strength doesn't always speak loudly, and if you're ready to watch power get tested in a way it never expected, subscribe now and stay with this story until the very end, because the greatest reversal doesn't happen in a boardroom. It happens in silence. In Manhattan's financial districts, my name traveled ahead of me. In private equity circles, it settled like pressure. By 48, I owned more property than I could visit in a calendar year and controlled assets large enough to alter entire neighborhoods with a single signature. Power stopped feeling like something I earned. It became something I inhabited. And when something becomes familiar, it also becomes invisible. When Nyla Bennett entered my life, she did not arrive through the front doors of my Hamptons estate. She came through the service entrance, holding a simple duffel bag and a temporary contract. That summer, the house was under renovation, and additional staff had been approved through operations. I signed off on the hires without looking at individual files. Efficiency required delegation. In my world, staff were structural, necessary, replaceable. I paid well, expected discretion, and assumed appreciation. I also carried a quiet belief that I rarely examined wealth-granted clarity about other people's needs. I assumed Nyla needed the job desperately. I assumed she depended on the income. I assumed proximity to my lifestyle would feel like advancement to her. That assumption settled comfortably in my mind. It required no evidence. From the first week, something about her disrupted that comfort. She moved through my kitchen with steady precision, as if the marble counters and imported fixtures held no emotional charge. There was no lingering glance at the artwork, no subtle awe at the scale of the estate. She acknowledged me when necessary, but her posture never tightened. She did not overcompensate with gratitude. She did not attempt to impress. I had grown accustomed to being needed. Investors needed my capital. Politicians needed my backing. Former partners needed my validation to remain relevant. Even competitors needed my restraint. Nyla did not appear to need anything from me beyond her agreed compensation. That unsettled me more than open defiance would have. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen island reviewing acquisition summaries while she polished the glass cabinets behind me. Most employees altered their pace when I worked nearby. A subtle stiffness entered their movements. Nyla did not change her rhythm. "Do you plan on staying in domestic work long-term?" I asked, keeping my tone measured. She paused just long enough to acknowledge the question. "I plan on doing whatever I choose to do well," she said evenly. The title doesn't define the direction. There was no attitude in her voice. No submission either. Just certainty. I nodded as if the answer were ordinary, but something inside me tightened. Her response carried autonomy. It did not orbit around me. Over the following days, I paid closer attention. She declined overtime politely. She left precisely when her hours ended. She never hovered in the hope of additional tasks. She didn't initiate small talk designed to create personal favor. When other staff members exchanged quiet gossip about the scale of my holdings, she remained silent. The more I searched for visible need, the less I found. So I created it. I convinced myself her restraint was pride. Perhaps she was intimidated and masking it. Perhaps she lacked the confidence to ask for opportunity. I began constructing a narrative where I would intervene strategically, generously, fund her education, offer housing in one of my developments, introduce her to people who could alter her trajectory. I framed it as mentorship. But beneath that framing was something far less generous, I needed to restore a hierarchy that felt unquestioned. One evening, during a private gathering at the estate, a colleague made an offhand remark about how fortunate the help must feel to work in homes like mine. The comment floated casually across the room. I watched Nyla from across the bar as she refilled glasses. She heard it. Her expression did not shift. No forced smile. No visible discomfort. She continued her work with the same steady precision. That composure unsettled me. I was accustomed to reactions, resentment, aspiration. Nyla offered none. For the first time, I considered a possibility that felt almost offensive. She might not see my wealth as transformative. I began reviewing her personnel file out of idle curiosity one night. Prior employment with private households, nonprofit affiliations, voluntary transitions, no urgent financial distress, no instability. The pattern suggested choice, not desperation. Choice unsettled me more than hardship would have, because choice meant she was not here because she had no alternative. It meant she was here because she decided to be. That realization disturbed the balance I relied upon. Power, as I understood it, required asymmetry. Someone had more, someone had less. Someone needed access. Someone controlled it. With Nyla, the equation felt incomplete. I found myself imagining conversations that would reestablish order. I would offer her something significant enough that refusal would be irrational. A funded certification program. A property lease below market value. A pathway into my corporate structure. When she accepted, as I believed she eventually would, the imbalance would clarify itself. She would acknowledge the difference between us. Late one evening, unable to quiet the unease, I cross-referenced her previous address listed in her employment history. A Brooklyn property from over 2 decades ago. The street name struck something in my memory. I had acquired an aging apartment complex in that area early in my career. Aggressively, efficiently. Tenants displaced under expedited legal procedures. It was one of the deals that strengthened my expansion trajectory. I pulled archived acquisition files from storage. The address matched. I leaned back in my chair, the room suddenly feeling larger than usual. I told myself it was coincidence. But I kept reading. A tenant roster from 25 years ago scrolled across my screen, and then I saw it. Bennett, not just once. 3 entries. Same unit. The air in my office shifted. Had she recognized my name before stepping into my house? Had she chosen proximity deliberately? For the first time since Nyla Bennett walked through my service entrance, I felt something unfamiliar tightening in my chest. It wasn't fear of losing money. It was the possibility that I had misunderstood the entire power dynamic from the beginning. I opened the eviction records attached to that acquisition, not yet prepared to see how deeply the name Bennett was woven into my earliest success. My first mistake was not the acquisition 25 years ago. It was curiosity fueled by pride. After seeing the name Bennett in those eviction records, I told myself I needed clarity. Not for guilt, for security. That was the justification I offered my operations director the next morning when I requested a discreet background review on Nyla Bennett. I framed it as protocol, standard due diligence. Anyone with access to my estate warranted scrutiny. In truth, it was control disguised as caution. I expected the report to reveal instability, credit issues, lingering debt, something unfinished that would confirm the narrative I had quietly constructed about her. I needed to see fracture lines, needed evidence that her composure was compensating for vulnerability. When the file landed in my inbox 48 hours later, I read it slowly. No criminal record, no outstanding liabilities, no financial distress markers, minimal digital presence. Employment history that reflected intention rather than accident. Nonprofit administrative roles, private households, every transition voluntary, no terminations, no complaints, no desperation. The absence disturbed me more than scandal would have. She rented a modest apartment in Queens, despite documented offers for live in positions in higher income households. She declined each of them. Compensation increases had not persuaded her. She chose limited hours by preference, not restriction. Her references described her with phrases that irritated me in their calm certainty, self-directed. intentionally private, highly observant. Intentionally private. The word lingered in my mind long after I closed the file. In my world, privacy was purchased, gated properties, non-disclosure agreements, security details. For Nyla, that privacy appeared to be discipline, a boundary not dependent on wealth. That distinction unsettled me. I began observing her more carefully, not with suspicion, but with something closer to confusion. She moved through my art, filled hallways as if they were simply corridors. She passed the fleet of cars in the driveway without lingering. No subtle shift in posture. No awe. One afternoon, she cleaned my office while I reviewed quarterly projections. Sunlight cut across the floor to ceiling windows, reflecting off framed awards and industry recognitions mounted behind my desk. Most staff adjusted themselves in that room. They softened their footsteps, lowered their voices. Nyla did not alter her pace. "You don't seem impressed by much," I said, not looking up from my screen. She continued dusting the bookshelf before answering. "Impressed by what, Mr. Whitaker?" The question was neutral, not challenging, just precise. "Success," I replied. There was a pause, not hesitation but consideration. "Success depends on who pays the price for it," she said evenly. "Sometimes it looks different from the outside." The words were not loud. They did not accuse me directly, but they landed with weight. I leaned back slowly, studying her profile. "And what does it look like from your side?" She met my eyes then. Calm. Unrushed. "It looks like stability when it protects people," she said. "And displacement when it doesn't." The air shifted. She did not mention Brooklyn. She did not mention the eviction file sitting in my locked drawer upstairs. But the implication rested between us, unspoken and deliberate. An unexpected realization struck me in that moment. She knew I had looked into her. "How long have you known?" I asked quietly. Her expression did not change. "Long enough." A thin line of tension formed in my chest. "You took this job anyway." "Yes." "For what?" I pressed. "To understand something," she replied, "and to confirm something." "And what was that?" She resumed, wiping the edge of my desk before answering. "Whether you were careless," she said, or calculated. The simplicity of it disarmed me. I had spent decades being feared, respected, negotiated with. I had never been evaluated so calmly. "You think I calculated harm?" I asked. "I think you calculated profit," she said. "The harm just wasn't your variable." There was no raised voice, no anger. That made it worse. A quiet, uncomfortable truth began forming beneath my defensiveness. I had never considered the families behind those numbers. I had considered occupancy rates, legal clearances, return on investment. "Why stay?" I asked, my tone lower now. "To see if you were capable of awareness," she said. And the word left me before I could restrain it. She held my gaze a moment longer than necessary. "I'm still deciding." For the first time in years, inside my own office, I felt measured instead of dominant. Not attacked, assessed. That subtle shift destabilized me. I told myself she was overestimating her influence, that her opinion did not alter market performance or shareholder confidence. Yet something in her restraint carried more weight than confrontation ever could. Instead of commanding the room, I felt studied. And in that study, I sensed no fear. That absence of fear unsettled me more than defiance would have. If she did not fear me, then the hierarchy I relied upon was thinner than I believed. I closed my laptop slowly. "You're ambitious," I said carefully. "Whether you admit it or not." Her eyebrow lifted slightly. "Ambition doesn't always look like climbing," she replied. "Sometimes it looks like choosing." The control I was accustomed to began slipping, not publicly, but internally. I needed to restore balance. I needed to remind her, and perhaps myself, of the scale of difference between us. So I made a decision. I would offer her something significant enough that refusal would seem irrational. A structured opportunity. Education funded outright. Housing security. Access. I would frame it as generosity, and when she accepted, the dynamic would clarify itself. What I did not yet realize was that I was about to make an offer that would expose just how wrong-eyed about who truly needed leverage in this house. The next morning, I prepared a proposal designed to change Nyla Bennett's future, never imagining she had already secured one that did not include me. I arranged the moment with precision. Control had always been my strength, so I treated the conversation like any other strategic move. I had my legal team draft a structured proposal under the guise of professional development. Full tuition coverage for any accredited program, she chose. A discretionary housing option within one of my stabilized properties at below market cost. Access to my corporate mentorship network. It was clean. Generous. Difficult to refuse. I invited Nyla into my office late in the afternoon when the house was quiet and the light filtered softly through the glass walls. The setting mattered. Environment shapes perception. I've been reviewing your file. I began, keeping my tone measured. You're capable of more than domestic work. She didn't flinch at the phrasing. She simply waited. I'm establishing a private development fund, I continued. Education, certifications, career placement. I'd like you to be one of the first recipients. I slid the folder across the desk. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at me first, not suspicious, just attentive. That's generous, she said calmly. It's practical, I corrected. Talent should be leveraged. There was a faint shift in her expression, not offense. Recognition. She opened the folder and skimmed the documents without visible excitement. No widening of the eyes, no breathless gratitude, just steady reading. Silence stretched between us. When she closed the folder, she aligned it neatly on my desk. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Whitaker, she said, but I'm already pursuing what I intend to pursue. The refusal was soft, controlled. Final. I felt it more sharply than open rejection. You haven't even asked what the full scope includes. I said, I don't need to. The simplicity of that answer unsettled me. You're turning down a fully funded future, I pressed. I'm not turning down a future, she replied evenly. I'm declining one that isn't mine. The words landed heavier than I expected. Most people negotiated when I extended opportunity. They asked for adjustments, clarifications, expansions. They rarely declined outright. You're limiting yourself, I said, and I heard the edge in my own voice. She met my gaze without raising hers. Or protecting myself? From what? From dependency framed as generosity. The room went still. There it was. Not loud, not aggressive. Just precise. I leaned back slowly, studying her. You think this is about control? I think you're used to being needed, she said. There's a difference. The statement struck deeper than accusation would have. I told myself she was misinterpreting my intent. That pride was clouding her judgment. Perhaps she feared obligation. Perhaps she didn't understand the scale of what she was declining. You'll reconsider, I said. She gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. I won't. And just like that, the meeting ended. No raised voices. No confrontation. She thanked me for the consideration and returned to her work as if nothing monumental had occurred. But something had shifted. The refusal unsettled me more deeply than criticism ever had. My identity had been constructed around upward mobility, creating it, distributing it, orchestrating it. For someone to reject my resources implied they were not universally transformative. It felt like irrelevance. Over the following weeks, I watched for signs of regret, a hesitation, a subtle softening. None appeared. Nyla's demeanor remained steady. She neither avoided me nor sought to mend tension. She worked with the same deliberate consistency as before. The stability of her composure began to feel like a mirror. I had confused authority with indispensability. Her refusal exposed the difference. My frustration evolved into quiet investigation. If she did not need money, what drove her? If not ambition in the traditional sense, what sustained her discipline? One evening, while reviewing estate payroll summaries, I noticed something peculiar. Nyla had declined overtime compensation multiple times. Additional hours were offered during renovation delays. She refused them all. She worked only what she agreed to work. No more, no less. It was deliberate restraint. I, who had spent decades accumulating properties, assets, leverage, was confronted with someone who measured life by an entirely different currency. Time, perhaps. Autonomy, distance. The deeper I tried to understand her, the more unstable my assumptions became. A week later, an unexpected detail surfaced. During a routine estate audit, I reviewed archive documents stored in the lower-level file room. Among old property records and renovation permits, I found a framed photograph tucked inside a portfolio case I hadn't opened in years. It was from an early ribbon-cutting ceremony, one of my first redevelopment projects in Brooklyn. I stared at the crowd behind me in the photo, faces blurred by time, until one face wasn't. A teenage girl standing near the barricade watching. Even in the faded image, I recognized the posture, the stillness, the assessment. My pulse slowed. The timestamp on the photograph matched the year of that eviction, and the girl in the background looked exactly like Nyla Bennett. I pulled the original tenant displacement file from storage, my hands no longer steady, realizing she may have been watching me long before I ever noticed her. The revelation did not arrive with noise. It arrived through paperwork. I stood alone in the lower-level archive room of my estate, fluorescent lights humming above rows of labeled storage boxes. The photograph I had found minutes earlier, the ribbon-cutting ceremony from Brooklyn, sat propped against a filing cabinet. My younger self stood at the podium, smiling into cameras, celebrating what the press had called urban renewal. Behind the barricade, a teenage girl watched, still, unsmiling, watching me. I pulled the acquisition file tied to that property and laid it across the metal table. The documents were brittle at the edges, 25 years old. Purchase agreements, condemnation notices, legal correspondence, tenant displacement records approved under expedited municipal allowances. Efficient. Profitable. Necessary, that was how I'd categorized the deal in my memory. I turned the page slowly. Unit 3B Bennett. Angela Bennett. Marcus Bennett. Nyla Bennett. My hand stopped moving. The room felt smaller. I read the date of notice again. Cross-referenced it with the employment file I had already reviewed upstairs. The addresses aligned. The timeline was exact. The acquisition that accelerated my expansion had dissolved that building within weeks of purchase. Structural concerns were cited. Renovation plans justified relocation. Legally compliant. Strategically executed. I had never considered the families behind those signatures. To me, they had been variables in a spreadsheet. Occupancy percentages. Risk assessments. Nyla had been 16. I leaned back against the cold filing cabinet, staring at her name printed in government font. The composure she carried in my home now felt different. Not mysterious. Informed. She was not unfamiliar with wealth's consequences. She had lived beneath them. An unfamiliar unease moved through me, not the sharp anxiety of market volatility, not the strategic stress of negotiation. This was something heavier. Personal. Moral. Had she known from the beginning? The dates suggested she would have recognized my name easily. I had been in local business headlines for months during that acquisition. If she had applied to work in my estate under her real name, she had done so deliberately. That silence between us, the one I had mistaken for deference, took on new weight. If she knew and chose not to reveal it, then her presence in my house was not accidental employment. It was proximity layered with history. I returned upstairs slowly, the polished floors beneath my shoes feeling strangely unstable. My estate, my symbol of achievement, no longer felt entirely mine. It felt observed. I found Nyla in the kitchen that evening, drying glassware. "Nyla," I said, my voice lower than usual. "I need to ask you something." She placed the towel down with unhurried precision and faced me. "Yes, Whittaker." I held the folder in my hand but didn't offer it to her. "Brooklyn," I began. 25 years ago. An apartment complex on Hawthorne Street. There was no flicker of confusion in her eyes. "I remember," she said. The absence of surprise confirmed everything. "You knew," I said quietly. "Yes." "How long?" "Since before I signed a contract to work here." The air seemed to thin between us. "And you didn't think to mention it." She tilted her head slightly, studying me the way she had in that photograph decades ago. "What would mentioning it have changed?" she asked. The question unsettled me because I did not have an immediate answer. "I displaced your family," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "You displaced a building." She corrected gently. "My family survived." The distinction was surgical. It was a legal acquisition. I added, hearing the defensiveness beneath my own explanation. I'm sure it was, she replied. Most harm with paperwork is. There was no shouting, no accusation. Just fact layered over memory. Why work here? I asked, unable to mask the edge in my voice now. Why put yourself under my roof? She held my gaze steadily. I wanted to see the man behind the signature, she said. And what did you find? She did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough to force me into discomfort. I found someone who confuses distance with innocence, she said at last. You weren't cruel. You were detached. That's different. But it still cost people. The word settled into me like weight. For the first time in my career, I felt examined not for my competence, but for my character. I had always believed power flowed in one direction. Now I wasn't sure. The girl in the photograph had been watching me long before I noticed her, and standing in my kitchen now was not someone in need of my approval. It was someone who understood my history more clearly than I ever had. I asked her one final question, whether she had come into my life for closure or for something else, and her answer threatened to dismantle more than just my past. That when I approached Nyla with the documents in my hand, I expected confrontation. Not anger necessarily, but something sharp, something earned. Instead, I encountered acknowledgement. We sat across from each other at the long dining table that had hosted senators and CEOs. The eviction records rested between us like a third presence. I had rehearsed explanations in my head, legal compliance, structural assessments, market timing. Prepared defenses shaped by decades of negotiation. She didn't force me to use them. That was our unit, she said softly, tapping the page with her finger. 3B, no trembling in her voice. No tremor in her hands. You remember it clearly, I said. You don't forget the week your mother tries to pretend everything is fine while packing your childhood into boxes. The statement wasn't accusatory. It was descriptive. I swallowed, something tightening in my chest. You were 16? I said. Yes. And your family relocated shortly after? Yes. Still no raised tone. No blame. What happened? I asked before I could stop myself. She leaned back slightly, folding her hands in her lap. My mother worked 2 jobs after that, she said. Why moved into a smaller place? Shared rooms. Learned quickly that stability is not guaranteed just because you pay rent on time. She paused, studying my face as if measuring how much I could absorb. It was destabilizing, she continued. Painful. But it also clarified something. We couldn't depend on systems to protect us, so we rebuilt. Slowly. Carefully. Her calm unsettled me more than rage would have. You don't blame me, I said, and it came out more like a question than a statement. She considered that. I don't think you knew us, she replied. You knew the building. The numbers. The margins. That's business, I said automatically, then heard how hollow it sounded. It is, she agreed. And business can still cost people. There was no villain in her narrative. No dramatic framing of me as a monster. That unsettled me most of all. For decades, I had categorized decisions like that acquisition as necessary collateral in competitive markets. Growth required friction. Expansion required sacrifice. I had never stopped to examine who absorbed that sacrifice. Hearing the human outcome reframed the memory. The deal that funded my early acceleration had fractured someone else's foundation. I recognized your name before I applied here. She added quietly. The words settled into the room like gravity. You chose this, I said. Yes. Why? She didn't hesitate. Not for revenge, she said. I don't carry enough energy for that. I exhaled slowly. I came because I wanted to understand something. Understand what? The kind of man whose signature can alter a family's trajectory without ever knowing their names. I had built my career on evaluating others, assets, executives, opportunities. Now I realized I had been evaluated. And? I asked, unable to disguise the vulnerability in the question. She held my gaze. I concluded you weren't cruel, she said. Cruelty is intentional. That should have relieved me. It didn't. You were detached? She continued. You insulated yourself from consequence. Efficient, strategic, but detached. The word echoed. And detachment, she added, can do damage without ever raising its voice. The diagnosis landed harder than accusation. I felt Something inside me, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. I had always taken pride in not being emotional in business, in separating outcome from sentiment. Now I saw the cost of that separation. "You think I harmed you," I said quietly. "I think your decisions harm people," she corrected. "Not because you hated them, because you didn't see them." There it was. The quiet racism embedded in detachment. The assumption that displacement was simply an adjustment for families like hers. That resilience would compensate for disruption. That communities accustomed to instability would absorb another fracture without permanent damage. I had never spoken those assumptions aloud, but they had guided my calculations. For the first time in my career, I confronted the personal cost embedded in my spreadsheets. "You're not asking for anything," I said. "No, no restitution. No apology. I didn't come here for that." "Then why stay?" I asked. She studied me for a long moment. "To see if awareness would change anything," she said. The statement lingered in the silence between us. "And will it?" I asked. She stood slowly, gathering the documents and sliding them back toward me. "That depends on you," she replied. "Not on me." Then she walked away, leaving me alone at a table built from reclaimed oak, wood salvaged from demolished buildings I once called progress. I stared at the file in front of me, understanding something with unsettling clarity. If I acknowledged what those documents truly represented, I would have to reconsider more than one acquisition, more than one strategy, possibly the foundation of my entire empire. I realized that correcting one past injustice might expose dozens more, and Nyla made it clear she would not tell me what to fix or how to fix it. After that conversation at the dining table, I stopped sleeping through the night. Spreadsheets began to look different. I returned to Manhattan that Monday and requested full archival reports on every major acquisition my firm had executed over the last 30 years. My executive assistant assumed it was preparation for an anniversary retrospective. I did not correct her. Alone in my office, I began reviewing projects I once celebrated. Displacement statistics, relocation timelines, community impact statements drafted in legal language designed to neutralize emotion. The clauses I had skimmed in pursuit of closing speed now felt heavier, almost accusatory. Temporary housing assistance provided. Notice periods legally sufficient. Market value compensation calculated. Each phrase sounded clinical. I started asking questions I had never asked before. How many families returned after redevelopment? How many small businesses survived relocation? What percentage of original tenants could afford the renovated units? The answers were not catastrophic. They were simply indifferent. I found patterns, neighborhoods already vulnerable absorbing the majority of our necessary transitions. Communities of color disparately classified as high-yield redevelopment zones. It had never been explicitly racial in language, but it had been strategically selective. And I had approved it. Nyla did not advise me. She did not encourage reform. She did not ask about my findings. She continued her work with the same measured composure, polishing surfaces in a house built partly on displacement. Her neutrality forced me into something uncomfortable action without validation. I realized I had grown accustomed to applause, investor confidence, media profiles, recognition for philanthropic gestures that cost little relative to my portfolio. This would be different. I convened a closed-door meeting with my real estate division. "We're restructuring our displacement protocols," I said, projecting calm authority. My chief financial officer frowned slightly. "On what grounds?" "On ethical grounds," I replied. The room went quiet. I outlined policy revisions, longer notice periods, guaranteed right of return clauses for tenants, binding caps on post, renovation rent increases in designated zones, mandatory community investment allocations embedded into every acquisition contract. Margins would tighten. They calculated it quickly. "This will reduce profitability in redevelopment corridors by time," my CFO said carefully. "I'm aware. And our investors, they'll adjust." They did not adjust easily. Within weeks, board members began requesting private calls. I heard words like reputational risk, unnecessary activism, deviation from proven strategy. One senior partner leaned back in his chair during a meeting and asked, "Since when did we start prioritizing sentiment over scale?" I held his gaze. "Since I realized scale without conscience compounds cost," I said. The tremor of potential loss became real. Not only profit, but influence. If shareholders withdrew confidence, my authority would weaken. Competitors would exploit hesitation. The irony was sharp. I once believed Nyla Bennett needed my resources to rise. But now I was risking those same resources because of what I had learned through her silence. She had never asked me to change. That absence of demand intensified the weight of responsibility. If she had demanded restitution, I could have framed my response as resolution. Instead, she had offered observation and left the rest to me. Independence, I realized, is the most disruptive force to ego-driven authority. By refusing to position herself as victim or beneficiary, she dismantled the hierarchy I relied upon. There was no transaction to complete. No emotional debt to settle. Only accountability to choose. My transformation was not dramatic. There were no press releases announcing moral awakening. Instead, there were quiet restitution funds established for previously displaced tenants where feasible. Legal frameworks revised to prioritize stabilization over turnover. Long-term affordability clauses woven into contracts where once there had been only exit strategies. Externally, I remained powerful. My offices still overlooked Manhattan. My signature still carried weight in negotiations. Internally, certainty collapsed. I no longer saw acquisitions as abstract growth. I saw them as intersections of families, histories, futures. One evening, after finalizing a revised redevelopment agreement that preserved an entire block of tenants instead of clearing it, I returned to the Hamptons estate later than usual. The house felt unusually still. In the hallway outside the guest quarters, I noticed Nyla's door slightly ajar. A single suitcase sat open on the bed. For a moment, I assumed it was temporary. Then, I saw the neatly folded resignation letter resting on her desk. As I picked up the envelope with my name written across it, I realized I had to confront a question I'd been avoiding. Was this transformation truly about justice, or had I been trying to earn her approval before she walked away? Nyla submitted her resignation at the end of the summer. There were no theatrics attached to it, no dramatic timing. The letter I had found on her desk was dated precisely to the final day of her temporary contract. She had completed every obligation she agreed to fulfill. No extensions requested. No negotiations entertained. I stood in the doorway of her room holding the envelope, feeling something I had not anticipated. Urgency. For weeks I had been restructuring divisions, revising contracts, confronting board resistance. I had convinced myself the work spoke for itself. That accountability did not require witnesses. Yet, as I stared at her packed suitcase, a quieter truth surfaced. I wanted acknowledgement, not applause. Not praise, just confirmation that she had seen the shift, that the policies I had rewritten were not abstract gestures, but evidence of awareness. I wanted to know that the man she had come to observe was no longer the one behind that signature 25 years ago. I found her in the kitchen, wiping down the counter for what would be the last time. "You're leaving," without saying anything. I said, unable to disguise the tension in my voice. She placed the cloth neatly beside the sink. "I submitted the letter," she replied calmly. "That says enough. You could have extended," I said. "The renovations are almost complete." My contract was clear. Her composure remained intact. "It always did have seen the changes," I said, stepping closer. "The policies, the redevelopment clauses, the restitution fund. I have," she acknowledged. "And," she studied me for a moment, not unkindly, "they're meaningful," she said. "For the families involved." The answer was precise, measured. "But?" I pressed. "There is no but," she replied softly. "It's not my place to evaluate your conscience." The statement landed harder than criticism. "I didn't do it for evaluation," I said quickly. "Then why mention it now?" The question froze me. I had no rehearsed response for that. She leaned against the counter, her posture relaxed. "You don't need my approval, Mr. Whittaker," she said. "If you're still looking for it, then you're not done yet." The words stripped something raw inside me. You came here to observe me, I said. You said that yourself? Yes. And what's your conclusion? She held my gaze steadily. You're capable of awareness, she said. That's more than I expected. There was no triumph in her voice. No satisfaction, just honesty. That's it. I asked, surprised by the vulnerability in my own tone. That's enough. I exhaled slowly, realizing how much weight I had placed on this moment. My family rebuilt a long time ago, she continued. We didn't need restitution to survive. We needed resilience. And you don't resent me? I said. I don't romanticize you either, she replied. Wealth doesn't equal worth, and loss doesn't equal weakness. The balance in her words struck me deeply. For months I had subconsciously positioned her as someone who stood beneath me financially, socially, structurally. Now I saw the reversal clearly. The greatest shift between us was not economic. It was moral. I had believed she entered my home in need. In truth, she had stood beside me with clarity I lacked. You never hated me, I said quietly. Hate requires obsession, she replied. I was looking for understanding. And did you find it? She paused. I found a man who can change when confronted with consequences, she said. That matters. But it's your responsibility to continue, not mine to monitor. That was the unexpected twist I hadn't prepared for. She was not leaving because she was disappointed. She was leaving because her role in my evolution was complete. When she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the service entrance, I followed a few steps behind. Not to stop her, just to witness the exit. At the doorway, she turned briefly. Take care of the people behind the numbers, she said quietly. Then she stepped outside. I did not feel abandoned. I felt measured. The house seemed larger after she left, quieter. The silence no longer neutral, it was reflective. For the first time since she walked through that same entrance months earlier, I stood alone with no one assessing me. As the door closed behind her, I realized the final lesson was not about policy or profit, but about what kind of man I would choose to be when no one was watching. Months passed after Nyla Bennett walked out of my estate, and the world did not collapse. My empire remained intact, reshaped, but standing. Profit margins stabilized at lower levels than my board preferred. A few investors withdrew. Others adjusted when they realized stability can be more durable than aggressive expansion. Business publications labeled me evolving. Analysts debated whether my policy shifts were strategic repositioning or late-stage reputation management. They were wrong in both directions. The true shift occurred privately. I no longer equated influence with indispensability. For decades, I had moved through the world assuming that those with less capital required my intervention. That assumption was subtle. It sounded like generosity in my own mind, but I began to recognize it for what it was: control disguised as benevolence. Assuming someone's need reduces their complexity. It compresses their autonomy into a hierarchy where I remain at the top. Nyla dismantled that illusion without raising her voice. She never asked for apology, never requested compensation, never demanded reform. She simply observed and refused to position herself beneath me. In that refusal, she removed the leverage I relied upon. One gray afternoon, I drove alone to Brooklyn. The Hawthorne Street property had long since been transformed into modern mixed-use housing under revised redevelopment protocols. This time, long-term affordability protections were embedded into the contracts. Right of return clauses guaranteed original tenants priority placement where feasible. Community investment funds were not optional, they were structural. I parked across the street and studied the building. It looked cleaner now. Safer. More stable. But I saw it differently than I had 25 years earlier. Back then, I saw square footage and yield potential. Now I saw doors. Behind each door, a family that deserved more than efficiency. A property manager approached me, recognizing my face from corporate briefings. Mr. Whittaker, he said, surprised. Why weren't expecting you? I'm not here for a tour, I replied. I walked the sidewalk slowly, remembering the photograph of my younger self smiling at a ribbon-cutting ceremony while a teenage girl watched from behind a barricade. I did not publicize the visit. There were no press releases, no staged photographs. Accountability loses meaning when it becomes marketing. Standing there, I reflected on the arrogance embedded in my original belief that wealth automatically positioned me as benefactor in every interaction. I had assumed Nyla needed me. In reality, she required nothing. And in that refusal, she restored something in me I hadn't realized I surrendered years ago. Moral awareness unlinked from transaction. For most of my career, every gesture carried strategic return. Donations secured influence. Development projects secured tax advantages. Even philanthropy was structured for leverage. Nyla's presence disrupted that framework. She did not respond to incentive. She responded to integrity. I returned to Manhattan that evening with a quiet understanding settling into place. Power without humility breeds detachment, and detachment, even when legal, fractures lives in ways balance sheets cannot record. I had once believed harm required cruelty. Now I understood it often requires only distance. The billionaire who thought his black maid needed him discovered something harsher. I had needed the confrontation more than she needed my money. Not for validation, for transformation. And the transformation endured precisely because it was not requested. Weeks later, during a board dinner, a senior partner raised a glass and joked lightly about my temporary moral awakening. The table laughed. I did not. It's not temporary, I said calmly. It's structural. The room quieted. For the first time in my career, I did not measure the impact of my words by how they affected perception. I measured them by whether they aligned with what I had learned. Externally, I remained Malcolm Whitaker, wealthy, influential, strategically sharp. Internally, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer needed to be indispensable to feel powerful. I needed to be accountable. Late one evening, alone in my office overlooking Manhattan, I caught my reflection in the glass. The skyline shimmered behind me, towers built by men who likely believed what I once believed. For a moment, I imagined Nyla standing behind me again, silent, observant. There was no resentment in that imagined gaze, only expectation. The story did not end when she left. It continued in every contract I signed, every clause I revised, every decision I made when no one was watching. And as I turned away from the window, I understood something that unsettled and steadied me. At the same time, being wrong had not diminished my power. It had finally defined it. Years from now, when another young woman walks into my building through a service entrance, the question will no longer be whether she needs me, but whether I have truly become the kind of man who deserves to lead.